as I stood there watching in silence. My name is Heidi, a 32-year-old accountant who has always believed that numbers tell a truth that people often try to hide. While I mourned, my older sister stood nearby looking entirely out of place in her flashy designer coat and inappropriate jewelry. She repeatedly checked the time on her expensive gold watch, with visible impatience because the funeral service was taking too long for her liking. I could not stop thinking about the strange financial ritual my mother had strictly maintained for over 2 decades without fail. She used to drive her old truck to the bank every single Friday morning to make a deposit into her savings account alone. I never questioned her routine because I trusted that she was building a secure future for her old age. However, the atmosphere in our house changed drastically during the last month when my sister suddenly returned home to play the role of a devoted child. She started visiting our mother constantly after years of total absence and hovered over her inside the house like a prison guard rather than a loving daughter. My mother looked terrified and small whenever she sat next to my sister during those frequent visits in her final weeks. I noticed how my mother would tremble slightly when my sister entered the room, yet she never spoke a word of complaint to me. I asked myself why my sister suddenly cared so much after ignoring our mother for 20 years. If you have ever felt in your gut that a family member was lying to you for their own gain, truth. As soon as the last hearse left the cemetery gates to return to the city, the atmosphere inside my mother's familiar one-story house immediately became tense and suffocating. My sister Gretchen wasted absolutely no time in asserting her authority over the situation by throwing her designer coat onto the worn sofa and declaring that we needed to settle the estate matters right there and then. She paced around the small living room with undisguised contempt while complaining about the dust and insisted that we needed to list the property for sale as soon as possible. She claimed that she required immediate capital for a crucial investment opportunity that could not wait for me to process my grief or sort through 20 years of accumulated memories. I stood my ground firmly against her proposal because I could not bear the thought of handing over the keys to strangers before we had even cleared the dinner table. I told her clearly that I intended to keep the house because it was the only physical piece of our childhood that remained intact. I tried to explain that this place held sentimental value that far outweighed whatever quick cash she hoped to extract from it, but my words only seemed to fuel her impatience. Gretchen looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language and began to list the potential market value of the land with cold, mathematical precision. She argued that holding on to a deteriorating asset was financial suicide and accused me of being selfish for blocking her access to what she considered her rightful share of the inheritance. The conflict escalated quickly when I refused to budge on my decision, causing her facade of sisterly patience to crack completely. She glared at me with cold eyes and snapped, "You do not dream of keeping this pile of rubble anymore. Sell it, split the money. Then we go our separate ways because I do not have time to play sentimental family games with you." Her callousness regarding the home where we grew up made my blood boil because she spoke about our history as if it were nothing more than a transaction to be finalized. I looked her straight in the eye to show her that I was no longer the little sister she could bully, and replied coldly, "What is the rush? Gretchen, Mom is barely cold, and you already want to erase her traces. I will not sign anything today." The argument reached its breaking point when she threatened to involve her lawyers to force the sale if I did not cooperate within the week. She grabbed her purse and stormed out of the front door in a fit of rage, leaving me alone in the sudden silence of the empty house. I locked the door behind her and felt a deep sense of unease settling in my stomach because her desperation for money seemed far too intense for someone who projected such a wealthy image. I remained in the hollow house while the darkness of the night slowly crept in, but sleep was impossible with so many unanswered questions swirling in my mind. I decided to search my mother's bedroom late that night to understand if there was any hidden paperwork regarding the financial pressure she seemed to be under during her final weeks. I turned on the small bedside lamp and began to methodically sift through the piles of documents she kept in her closet. I checked through old utility bills and medical records for hours, hoping to find a loan agreement or an overdue notice that might explain why Gretchen was so eager to liquidate the assets. My search initially yielded nothing but mundane receipts, until I decided to check the heavy wooden dresser where Mom used to keep her most private belongings. I carefully removed the drawers one by one to check behind them, and ran my hands along the interior frames to see if anything was taped out of sight. After several minutes of fruitless groping, my fingers finally brushed against something hard that had been carefully concealed beneath the floral paper lining of the bottom drawer. I pulled back the lining to reveal a small red notebook that was tucked away in the exact spot where she used to keep her modest collection of jewelry. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the worn cover, expecting to find a diary or perhaps a list of family birthdays. Instead, the handwritten entries inside the notebook caused my heart to pound in my chest because they detailed a financial history I never knew existed. For 20 consecutive years, the pages were filled with consistent entries marked as deposit every single Friday without fail. The amounts were modest but steady, proving that she had been building a substantial safety net for decades. However, my breath caught in my throat when I turned to the very last page of the ledger. There was a single shocking entry dated just 4 weeks ago marked withdrawal, written in shaky, scribbled handwriting that barely resembled her usual neat script. The entry showed that the entire balance had been drained in one single transaction, leaving the account completely empty just days before her death. 9 o'clock on Friday morning, exactly 1 week after my mother passed away, I arrived at the local bank branch clutching the executor paperwork. I walked past the line of customers waiting at the tellers and marched directly toward the glass office at the back of the building because I was not there to make a simple withdrawal. I demanded to see Mrs. Henderson immediately and informed the receptionist that I would not leave until the branch manager explained the irregularities I had discovered in my mother's financial records. The young assistant looked alarmed by my stern demeanor and quickly ushered me into the main office where Mrs. Henderson was reviewing a stack of loan applications. I did not waste any time with social pleasantries as I placed the heavy stack of legal documents onto her desk to establish my authority over the estate. I told her firmly that I required a full explanation regarding the sudden liquidation of the savings account that my mother had meticulously built over 2 decades. Mrs. Henderson adjusted her glasses nervously as she verified the executor documents and began to pull up the digital records on her computer screen while I waited in silence. She confirmed that my mother had been one of their most consistent and disciplined customers for over 20 years without a single missed deposit. The digital history displayed a long column of weekly credits that perfectly matched the handwritten notes in the red diary I had found the night before. Mrs. Henderson noted with professional admiration that my mother had treated that savings account like a sacred vault because she had never withdrawn a single cent until that fateful day last month. I leaned forward to inspect the screen and felt a wave of confusion when I saw that the account was solely in my mother's name with no other authorized signatories. This discovery meant that my mother had total legal control over the funds, which made her decision to empty the account even more baffling and suspicious. I pressed the manager for more details about the specific day the withdrawal took place because I needed to understand the context of such a drastic financial decision. Mrs. Henderson hesitated for a moment before she admitted that the transaction had raised some internal concerns among the staff at the time. She described my mother as looking uncharacteristically disheveled and frantic when she approached the counter, which was a stark contrast to her usual composed demeanor. The manager recalled that my mother was sweating profusely despite the air conditioning and kept glancing toward the exit as if she were afraid of being watched by someone. I felt a knot form in my stomach as I listened to the description of my mother's terror and realized that she must have been under immense duress. I looked the manager in the eye and asked the most critical question of all regarding whether my mother had entered the bank alone or if she had company. Mrs. Henderson sighed deeply and admitted that my mother was not alone that morning, because there was another woman standing right behind her the entire time. She described this companion as a woman wearing large, dark sunglasses, who stood uncomfortably close to my mother with her hand firmly planted on my mother's shoulder. The manager explained that the woman in sunglasses never spoke, but her physical presence seemed to exert a controlling influence over every move my mother made. The image of my mother being physically steered through a bank lobby like a hostage made my blood run cold as I realized the extent of the coercion. I demanded to know why the bank staff proceeded with the transaction, if they clearly observed that their client was in such a visible state of distress. Mrs. Henderson looked down at her hands and said in a quiet voice, "I tried to ask Mrs. Clara if she was okay, but she just shook her head and pushed the withdrawal slip toward me. She was shaking so much she couldn't even hold the pen." Her admission of passivity in the face of such obvious abuse shattered whatever professional respect I had for her and ignited a fire of indignation inside me. I stood up abruptly from my chair because I could no longer contain the rage I felt on behalf of the defenseless woman who had trusted this institution. I slammed my hand down on the polished mahogany desk and shouted, "You say my mother was trembling and terrified, yet you still let her walk out the door with a massive bag of cash. That is unacceptable negligence." I informed Mrs. Henderson that I would be filing a formal complaint against her branch for failing to protect a vulnerable senior citizen from financial exploitation. I declared that I would not leave the premises until she provided me with the security footage from that day to prove who exactly walked out of those doors with my mother's life savings. 10 o'clock in the morning, I called my husband Mark, asking him to bring his security badge to help me deal with the technical department. Mark arrived at the bank branch less than 20 minutes later, wearing his professional demeanor like a suit of armor, because he knew exactly how stubborn corporate security protocols could be. He flashed his credentials to the head of bank security and spoke in the low, authoritative tone that he used during high-level investigations to bypass the usual bureaucratic red tape that Mrs. Henderson tried to put in our way. The security chief hesitated for a moment but eventually led us into the small, air-conditioned server room at the back of the building, where the digital history of the premises was stored on massive hard drives. We sat down in front of the bank of monitors while the technician typed in the specific date and time that corresponded to the fraudulent withdrawal my mother had made the previous month. The screen flickered to life to reveal a grainy black and white feed of the rear parking lot, which was an area usually reserved for employees and armored cash transport vehicles. A sleek red sports car entered the frame a few seconds later and pulled aggressively into a narrow space that was deliberately hidden from the main road and the primary security cameras. I immediately recognized the vehicle as the expensive new model that Gretchen had been bragging about purchasing recently, which confirmed my suspicion that she was the woman in sunglasses. The passenger door remained closed, while Gretchen waited inside with the engine running, forcing my mother to walk out of the bank's rear exit completely unaided despite her visible frailty. My heart broke into pieces as I watched my sister exit the driver's side, not to help our mother, but to march around the vehicle with the aggressive posture of a predator closing in on wounded prey. Gretchen did not offer a steadying hand to the woman who gave her life, but instead she clamped her fingers around Mom's upper arm with a grip so tight that I could almost feel the bruise forming through the screen. She practically dragged my mother across the asphalt toward the car, ignoring the fact that Mom was stumbling and struggling to keep up with her rapid pace. The video clearly showed that this was not a family outing but a hostage situation, where the victim was being coerced into compliance through physical intimidation. The situation on the screen escalated quickly when they reached the passenger side of the red sports car, where the final exchange took place. Gretchen did not bother to open the door for Mom, but instead she reached out and violently snatched the heavy envelope of cash from my mother's trembling hands. The force of her sudden movement was so violent that it caused my mother to lose her balance and stumble backward, nearly collapsing onto the hard concrete surface of the parking lot. Gretchen did not even flinch or reach out to catch her, showing a complete lack of empathy for the physical safety of her own mother. She threw the envelope into the car and climbed back into the driver's seat, immediately leaving my mother standing alone and disoriented in the middle of the empty lot. Just before the car peeled away, the window rolled down halfway, and Gretchen threw a crumpled piece of paper directly at my mother's chest. Mom caught the paper instinctively and stood there clutching it to her heart, while the red car sped away, leaving her stranded without a ride home. The callousness of the act was so overwhelming that the technician in the room looked away in embarrassment. Mark leaned closer to the monitor with a look of absolute disgust on his face as the video ended. Mark pointed at the screen, his voice tightening. "Honey, look, that is not the action of a daughter. That is the action of a mugger. She is attacking Mom." I felt a mixture of sorrow and burning rage rising in my throat as I realized the extent of the cruelty my mother had endured in silence. I gritted my teeth, eyes watering. She left Mom there. Mom couldn't even stand up. "I swear I will make Gretchen pay for every single tear Mom shed." We both stared at the frozen image on the screen, where the crumpled piece of white paper was visible in my mother's hand. We realized simultaneously that the paper she was holding was not trash, but the key to understanding why my mother had submitted to such abuse. That evening, back at Mom's old house, Mark and I decided to tear the room apart one more time to search for the mysterious piece of paper Gretchen had thrown back. We moved every single piece of heavy furniture in the bedroom and inspected every crack in the floorboards because we knew that the crumpled document held the answer to this entire nightmare. The physical exhaustion was beginning to weigh heavily on both of us after hours of fruitless searching, but the image of my mother being assaulted in that parking lot gave us the adrenaline to keep going. Mark finally got down on his stomach to crawl completely under the antique oak bed frame, where he spotted something pushed all the way against the far wall. He reached out his arm to retrieve a small rusty metal box that had been sealed shut with multiple layers of thick industrial tape, as if to keep its contents buried forever. My hands were trembling uncontrollably as I used a pocket knife to slice through the heavy adhesive tape so I could pry open the corroded lid of the container. Inside the box, sitting on top of a stack of old receipts, was the very same piece of wrinkled paper that we had seen Gretchen throw at my mother on the security footage. I carefully smoothed out the crinkled sheet on the mattress and gasped when I recognized the official letterhead of the large corporate firm where both Gretchen and I had been employed more than a year ago. The document appeared to be a photocopy of a highly confidential internal investigation report, or perhaps a draft of a police warrant that was dated approximately 14 months in the past. I felt the blood drain from my face as the memories of that specific time period came flooding back to me with terrifying clarity. I remembered that Gretchen had been the senior regional manager at the company, while I was working as a junior accountant under her direct supervision during that fiscal quarter. There had been rumors of missing funds in the department at the time, but Gretchen had assured me back then that it was merely a software glitch that she would handle personally. The document in front of me twisted that reality into a malicious lie because it falsely identified me as the primary suspect in a massive embezzlement scheme. The narrative became sickeningly clear as I realized that Gretchen had used her position of authority to fabricate this evidence and convince our mother that I was a criminal who stole company money. It became obvious that Gretchen had terrified Mom by telling her that I was on the verge of being arrested and sent to federal prison unless the stolen money was secretly repaid in installments. My poor mother had believed every word of the lie because it came from her eldest daughter, who was a manager, and she had silently taken on the burden of repaying a debt that never existed. She had spent the last year of her life living in constant fear that the police would come for her youngest child, which explained why she never asked me about it directly. The reason for the sudden and total withdrawal of her savings in the final month was likely due to Gretchen inventing a new crisis about the case being reopened. She must have told Mom that the investigators needed a final lump sum payment to close the file permanently before Mom died, effectively robbing her of everything she had left. I picked up the damning piece of paper with fingers that felt like ice, and read the fabricated accusations aloud through my tears. Heidi, holding the paper, her voice trembling, reading, "Notice of internal financial violation. Suspect Heidi." Oh my God, she used my honor to blackmail our own mother. The realization that my mother had died thinking I was a thief broke my heart into a million pieces because she had sacrificed her comfort to save me from a punishment I did not deserve. Mark squeezed his wife's shoulder tightly to reassure her. "Mom sacrificed everything for you, Heidi. She thought she was saving you from prison. We have to clear your name and get justice for Mom." We knew in that moment that this was no longer just a family dispute over inheritance, but a criminal act of fraud that had preyed upon a mother's unconditional love. The next morning, I drove to the dilapidated apartment complex on the outskirts of the city to find Fred, the former HR manager. The building was a depressing structure with peeling paint and broken windows that seemed to reflect the ruined state of the man who lived inside. I walked through the dimly lit hallway that smelled of stale tobacco smoke and knocked hesitantly on the door of apartment 4B, hoping that he was actually home. It took several minutes of persistent knocking before the door finally creaked open to reveal a man who looked nothing like the sharp professional I remembered from the office. Fred stood there in a stained undershirt with bloodshot eyes and a heavy scent of cheap whiskey clinging to him despite the early hour. He looked at me with suspicion until he recognized who I was, and then he simply stepped aside to let me enter his chaotic living space without saying a word. The apartment was littered with empty bottles and unpaid bills, which served as a testament to how far he had fallen since losing his job 2 months ago. I sat on the edge of a worn-out sofa while Fred poured himself another drink with a trembling hand and asked me bitterly why the sister of the woman who ruined his life was visiting him. He did not try to hide the intense hatred he felt for Gretchen as he explained that she had fired him without cause solely to protect her own position. Fred told me that he had stumbled upon some questionable accounting discrepancies during a routine audit of the previous year's payroll and bonuses. He had foolishly confronted Gretchen about the numbers, thinking it was a mistake, but she immediately terminated his contract the very next day, citing restructuring to silence him. I waited for his rant to subside before I reached into my bag and pulled out the crumpled photocopy of the fake police report that we had found in the rusty box. I placed the document on the coffee table in front of him and watched his expression shift from confusion to absolute disbelief as he read the fabricated accusations against me. I expected him to be shocked, but instead Fred threw his head back and let out a dry, humorless laugh that sounded more like a bark. He shook his head while looking at the paper and told me that my sister was even more creative and manipulative than he had ever imagined. He explained that the embezzlement mentioned in the report was actually a massive loss that Gretchen had incurred herself by gambling with company funds on high-risk stocks more than a year ago. Fred clarified that there was never any investigation against me because Gretchen had successfully covered up her theft by blaming a glitch in the new financial software system. She had used her authority to manipulate the IT logs and wipe the server clean so that corporate headquarters believed the money was lost due to a technical error rather than fraud. However, she needed a scapegoat to explain the missing cash to our mother in order to extract money from her, so she invented the lie about me being the criminal. Fred looked at me with a mixture of pity and anger as he realized that Gretchen had destroyed his career to hide the same secret she used to rob our mother. He leaned forward with a sudden intensity in his eyes and told me that Gretchen had made one fatal mistake when she decided to fire him without severance pay. He revealed that he had anticipated she might try to scapegoat him as well, so he had secretly made a copy of the original transaction logs before his access was revoked. Fred took a long drag from his cigarette, smirking. "Your precious sister kicked me to the curb to tie up loose ends. Does she think I am stupid? I saved all of her transaction logs onto a private hard drive." My heart raced as I realized that this man held the smoking gun that could put Gretchen away for a very long time. I needed him to understand that this was not just about corporate politics or wrongful termination, but about the death of a woman who had been deceived until her last breath. I looked straight into Fred's eyes. Fred, I need that hard drive. She did not just fire you, she deceived my mother to death. Help me put her in prison, and you will have the sweetest revenge. The mention of my mother's death seemed to sober him up instantly, as he realized the true human cost of Gretchen's greed. He nodded slowly and agreed to hand over the digital evidence, and even offered to record a sworn statement detailing exactly how she had orchestrated the cover-up. We spent the next hour formulating a plan to use his evidence to ambush Gretchen when she least expected it. That weekend, I called Gretchen to the house with a tired and resigned tone, saying that I was ready to hand over the house papers. I told her that the emotional burden was too great, and I just wanted to sign everything over so I could move on with my life. Gretchen agreed to come over immediately with a smug satisfaction in her voice, clearly believing that her pressure tactics had finally broken my spirit. She arrived at the front door promptly at 7 o'clock, looking absolutely triumphant in a tailored business suit accompanied by a man she introduced as Mr. Sterling, her personal attorney. They walked into the dining room with an air of superiority and sat down at the table as if they were presiding over a corporate hostile takeover. Gretchen placed her expensive handbag on the table and looked at me with disdain, while her lawyer opened his briefcase to prepare for the transfer of the property title. I played the role of the defeated sister perfectly by keeping my head down and speaking in a soft, trembling voice that suggested I was on the verge of total collapse. I admitted that I was not strong enough to manage the estate on my own and pushed a thick, heavy folder across the wooden table toward her. The folder contained a stack of impressive-looking documents which were actually just old tax returns I had organized to look like transfer deeds, but she was too eager to notice. Gretchen opened the folder with greedy anticipation, while her lawyer leaned in to verify the signatures, neither of them suspecting that they were walking straight into a carefully orchestrated ambush. She pulled out a gold fountain pen and uncapped it with a flourish, ready to claim ownership of the only home I had ever known. The room was so quiet that I could hear the scratching of the pen nib as she lowered it toward the paper. Just as the tip of her pen was about to make contact, I suddenly sat up straight and dropped the facade of weakness completely. I looked over her shoulder and gave a sharp nod to Mark, who was standing quietly in the corner, holding a remote control behind his back. Mark pressed the play button, and the large television screen mounted on the wall behind Gretchen suddenly roared to life with the grainy footage from the bank parking lot. Gretchen froze instantly with her pen hovering in midair as she stared at the undeniable image of herself dragging our frail mother across the concrete like a prisoner. The silence was shattered a moment later when the audio track switched to a crystal-clear voice recording that boomed through the speakers. It was Fred's voice detailing exactly how Gretchen had embezzled company funds more than a year ago to cover her gambling losses, and then framed me to extort money from our mother. The color drained from Gretchen's face until she looked as pale as a sheet, and she dropped the gold pen onto the table in horror. She realized in that terrifying second that I had known everything all along, and that she had walked voluntarily into a room where her crimes were being broadcasted. Gretchen screamed when she saw the video, "Turn that garbage off right now. What the hell are you doing, Heidi? Are you trying to set up your own sister?" She lunged across the table with her fingers curled into claws, intending to rip the documents or attack me to stop the humiliation. I stood up, my voice ice cold. "I am not setting you up, Gretchen. I am just showing you the horror movie where you are both the director and the lead actor, and the ending will take place in prison." Before she could reach me, Mark moved with the speed of a trained professional and intercepted her, twisting her arms firmly behind her back to restrain her. At that precise moment, the door to the kitchen swung open, and Sheriff Miller stepped out into the dining room wearing his full uniform. He had been listening to the entire exchange, and his expression was one of absolute disgust as he looked at the woman struggling in Mark's grip. The lawyer backed away in shock, realizing his client was a criminal. Sheriff Miller stepped out. "Gretchen, you are under arrest for fraud, asset misappropriation, and elder abuse. You have the right to remain silent." 1 month after Gretchen was led away in the police car with her hands handcuffed tight, the trial took place quickly. The overwhelming evidence provided by Fred combined with the security footage left her defense attorney with absolutely no room to maneuver during the proceedings. The judge was particularly appalled by the calculated nature of her crimes against a vulnerable family member and handed down a sentence of 15 years in a federal correctional facility without the possibility of early parole. Her downfall was absolute because her husband filed for divorce the very next day to protect his own financial assets from the scandal. He also petitioned for and received full custody of their children, ensuring that Gretchen would spend the next decade completely isolated from the family she had treated as pawns in her greedy game. I returned to the house in Birmingham one last time to prepare it for sale, because I realized that I could not live within walls that had witnessed so much silent suffering. The rooms no longer held the warmth of my childhood, but instead echoed with the invisible tension and fear that my mother had endured during her final year of life. I signed the listing papers with a heavy heart, but a clear conscience, knowing that a new family would bring fresh energy to the space that Gretchen had poisoned with her manipulation. It was necessary to sever the physical tie to this place in order to release the heavy burden of the past that had been suffocating us since the funeral. The court ordered the seizure of Gretchen's assets to repay the money she had stolen from our mother, including the sale of the red sports car she used during the assault. I decided that I could not keep a single cent of that money for myself because it felt tainted by the betrayal and pain it represented. Instead, I used every dollar recovered to establish the Clara Memorial Scholarship Fund, which was dedicated to providing financial and legal aid to elderly victims of domestic abuse and financial exploitation. I knew that using the money to protect others from predators like my sister was the only way to truly honor the generous spirit of the woman who raised us. Mark and I used our own savings to purchase a large recreational vehicle, which had been my mother's lifelong dream that she never got the chance to fulfill. We packed our belongings and prepared to leave Birmingham behind to embark on a cross-country journey to visit all the national parks she had marked on her old map. It was our way of taking her spirit with us on an adventure to find the peace and freedom that had been stolen from her during those last painful months. We felt a sense of liberation as we loaded the last box, knowing that we were no longer bound by the secrets that had destroyed our family. I stood before my mother's grave for the final time under a clear blue sky that offered a stark contrast to the rain that fell on the day of her funeral. I touched the cold stone marker and whispered a promise to her that I would live a life defined by honesty and happiness rather than obligation and fear. I told her that justice had been served and that she could finally rest in peace knowing that her sacrifice was known and her abuser could no longer hurt anyone. I walked away from the cemetery without looking back, ready to start a new chapter on the open road with the husband who had stood by my side through the storm. The most valuable lesson I learned through this tragedy is that blind loyalty to family should never come at the cost of your own intuition or safety. My mother spent 20 years trying to protect a lie because she loved her child, but that silence only allowed the monster to grow stronger until it consumed her. We must understand that true love is based on honesty and respect, and anyone who uses fear to control you does not deserve a seat at your table even if they share your blood. The truth may be painful to confront in the beginning, but it is the only path that leads to genuine freedom and peace of mind. Thank you so much for listening to my story until the very end and walking this difficult path of discovery with me. I hope my experience encourages you to look closer at the relationships in your own life and protect those you love from manipulation. Please share your thoughts in the comments below,